When using a real camera, items that are moving extremely fast often become blurry. In LightWave, if we want to recreate this, we can use motion blur. And there's several options for motion blur, and I thought we could take a look at the different options and take a closer look at some of the detailed settings that we can use. So what I thought we could do is I've got an animation of this blade rotating, and I thought we could take a look at the different motion blur options when using this. So what I'll do is I'm going to pick a frame. We'll pick frame 98, and instead of rendering the entire image, I'm going to come over to Render, Limited Region, and let's just get this area right here. Okay. And I'm going to click it twice so that we won't have the borders. That's the same as going to render globals and using no borders. Okay. So what I'll do is go over to the camera properties panel, and right now we're set with the classic camera. That's the default camera. I'm going to have anti-aliasing set to enhance low. That's 5 passes of anti-aliasing. And for motion blur, down here in motion effects, it's set to off. I'm going to do a render just so we can do some comparisons. Okay, and this is the image that we get without motion blur. I'm going to set motion blur to classic, and I'm going to leave the default settings, and we'll kind of talk about these settings in a minute. And I'm going to go ahead and do a render. And let me zoom in. I'm going to open this up a little bit. And what we're seeing is the item in motion. And what the classic motion blur does is for every pass of anti-aliasing, it's going to render the object, and then it stacks those up. So if you don't want to see this stepped motion, it kind of looks like onion skinning. If you don't want to see this stepped motion, well, you need more passes of anti-aliasing. Okay, so if we go to the first one, this is what the object looks like without motion blur, and this is with classic motion blur at 5 passes of anti-aliasing. Okay, so we've got 5 blades all kind of composited on top of each other. It all gets put on top of each other, and it gives the appearance at a distance, gives the appearance of motion. Now, if you want to increase the quality, again, you could increase the levels of anti-aliasing, or you could come down to motion blur dither, and I'm going to set this back to 100%. Do a render. Okay, and if we toggle back and forth, the dithered motion blur looks better than the classic. Now, I'm going to just zoom in. Now, it didn't take longer to render, because what it's doing is it's doubling up the frames, but as you can see, the quality of them isn't as good. But when it's in motion, we're looking at a still frame, but when it's in motion, you really can't tell in most cases, and it's a quick way of getting better motion blur, but you don't have to up the anti-aliasing. So you have those two options, dither and classic. Okay. Now, if we come back over to motion blur, there's another option, but it's grayed out, and that's photoreal motion blur, which is true 3D motion blur. Okay. The way we can gain access to this is if we use any camera other than the classic camera. So I'm going to switch to perspective camera. Okay. And I'm going to have my anti-aliasing set to 5 passes, just so that it's the equivalent of what we used with the classic camera. And then I'm going to set the motion blur to photoreal. And we get options for the motion blur passes. We get options. Default, it would be 1. I'm going to set this back to 100%, and let's do a render. Okay. And I'm just going to zoom in. And there is no stepping. It's actually one blade that we've caught in motion. Okay. If you want, you can change the motion blur passes. We can up that. I'm just going to go 5 passes so we can kind of compare what happens when we up the quality of our anti-aliasing. And I'm going to do a render. Okay, let's go back to 300. Okay, if we look at our motion blur here, I'm going to step back to the 1 pass. So we can control the number of motion blur passes independent of our anti-aliasing. So we can have anti-aliasing in the scene, and instead of, in the past, if you wanted to use, or if you just want to use the classic motion blur or dither, when you set the anti-aliasing level, that's global. It's for everything in the scene. And so sometimes you don't need a high anti-aliasing setting for the scene, but you need it for the motion blur. And unless you're compositing, you'll have to do the setting for everything in the scene. So being able to set the anti-aliasing for the image, but then independently setting the motion blur passes for our motion blur can really speed up render time and allow us to just put the the calculations where they're needed. Okay, so if we compare this motion blur with this motion blur, or that was dither and this is classic, you should be able to see immediately the difference. I mean, look at the quality of this motion blur compared to the other motion blurs. Does that mean that the other motion blurs are obsolete? Well, you can actually take advantage of the old motion blurs for some neat tricks, doing some subframe color changes and things like that. But if you want to go for a photorealistic looking animation, if you're going to be compositing it into live action or anything like that, you're probably better off going the photoreal route, so that you can get this nice photoreal motion blur. Okay, so we need to remember that with photoreal motion blur, you can separate out anti-aliasing and motion blur passes. Okay, the blur length sets the time that the simulated camera shutter will be open during a frame. So a setting of 1 would mean that the shutter is open for the entire frame. A setting of 0.5 or 50% would mean that the shutter is open for half the frame and it's kind of a more typical setting. Okay, increasing this value increases the length of the motion blur streaks. Okay, so that's blur length, and by default it's 50%, and I usually keep it there unless I want to go for a different effect. Okay, the shutter efficiency controls how long it takes the simulated camera shutter to open and close. Okay, limited to a range of 0.5 to 1. Okay, and a value of 1 means that the shutter opens instantly and closes instantly at the beginning and end of each frame. Okay, so that's a quick look at the different options. Remember that the photoreal option is only available for the perspective cam. Well, it's for everything except the classic camera. Okay, but even in the perspective camera, you can choose the other options, classic and dither. But photoreal is really the route to go if you're going for a nice realistic motion blur. And you have these options right in the camera properties panel. Another handy feature when working with motion blur is, I'm going to go ahead and close down my renders and close down my camera, is that if I want to see it in OpenGL, I just have to come right over here and choose, I can preview depth of field and motion blur right in OpenGL. So I can see it. I'm scrubbing through my timeline and I can see the motion blur to give me an idea of what I might get. So it's a nice little preview. Gives me a quick look of what I might get whenever I go to do my render, and it lets me know what's going to be taking advantage of motion blur and what's not, all in real time in my viewport. So again, that's just a quick look at the motion blur options in LightWave.